Picture a rectangle of dirt 800 feet long and 300 feet wide. That's roughly 4 football fields laid side by side on a quiet hillside above the town of Forest Hill, California. Sometime in the 1880s, a small mining crew worked that single patch of ground. Not from the surface, and not with the water cannons that made the California gold rush famous. They worked from underground, through a tunnel driven straight into the mountain. When the claim was finally worked out, the tally came to $1,500,000 in gold, in 1880s dollars. Here is the part that should stop you. There was no river anywhere near that hillside. Not a stream, not a creek, nothing a map would show you. And yet the miners knew, with total confidence, exactly where to dig. Because buried directly beneath their boots was the bed of a river that had carried water, gravel, and gold millions of years before a single person stood there to look for it. A river with no name that anyone remembers. A river that vanished so long ago, geologists still argue over exactly when it stopped flowing. They weren't chasing a vein of quartz or a lucky nugget kicked up by a flood. They were chasing a ghost of moving water, sealed under solid rock, and they were willing to tunnel through a mountain to reach it. Some of those tunnels would eventually run for more than a mile through solid rock, chasing channels that stretched for miles underground in return. One buried river the miners found measured, at its widest point, more than 1,600 feet across, wider than 4 football fields laid end to end. None of it was visible from the surface. All of it had to be found the hard way, by digging blind and hoping the mountain agreed with the geology. This wasn't a one-off. Across the Sierra Nevada foothills, for roughly half a century, thousands of miners did exactly this. Sinking shafts, driving horizontal tunnels, sometimes more than a mile long, working entirely by candlelight and blasting powder, hunting for rivers that had stopped existing before the mountains around them have their current shape. Some of those tunnels connected to each other underground, stretching for miles beneath the surface, and some of them, without anyone intending it, dug straight into evidence that upended what 19th century science thought it knew about how long people had lived in North America. All of it to reach a river nobody living had ever seen, and that, geologically speaking, nobody ever could. That's the strange, half-forgotten story of California's drift mines, the underground gold rush that almost nobody remembers, hiding in plain sight under hills you might drive past without a second thought. Most people who've heard of the California gold rush picture the same thing: a man crouched at a riverbank, swirling water and gravel in a metal pan, hoping for a flash of yellow. That image isn't wrong, it's just incomplete, and it stopped being the whole story almost as soon as the rush began. Here's the real question worth asking. If panning a river was already working, why would anyone go to the trouble of tunneling into a mountain, in the dark, with no guarantee they'd even find the gold-bearing gravel until they hit it? Why abandon a method that required nothing but a pan and a strong back, for one that required timber bracing, ventilation, blasting powder, and years of unpaid digging before a single ounce came out? The answer is simple and a little uncomfortable, because the easy gold ran out. Fast. Within a handful of years of the first strikes, the gravel sitting conveniently in modern riverbeds had mostly been picked over. What remained, the vast majority of the gold still in the ground, wasn't in any river a person could see. It was locked inside the skeletons of rivers that no longer existed. Ancient channels, buried under later layers of rock, dirt, and in some places solidified lava, left behind when California's landscape rearranged itself millions of years before anyone was around to notice. So why doesn't anyone remember this part? Partly because hydraulic mining, the other method miners developed to reach these same buried channels, using high-pressure water cannons to wash entire hillsides away, left behind dramatic, visible scars that are still photographed today. Drift mining left almost nothing. No blasted-out canyons, no eroded moonscapes, just quiet tunnel mouths, mostly collapsed now, scattered through forest land that has long since grown back over them. And partly because drift mining doesn't fit the story we like to tell about the gold rush, the lone prospector, the lucky strike, the overnight fortune. What actually happened in dozens of districts across the Sierra Nevada foothills was closer to industrial-scale underground engineering. Companies, payrolls, ore cars running on rails, tunnels stretching for miles beneath the surface, all built to chase rivers that had stopped flowing before the first primates existed anywhere on Earth. So here's what we're actually going to dig into. Not just how miners found these vanished rivers, but how they figured out where to look in the first place, how deep they were willing to go, what they found along the way that they never expected, including something that accidentally started a scientific fight lasting decades, and why, eventually, all of it stopped being worth the effort. It's a bigger story than a pan and a riverbank. It's the story of an underground gold rush that ran for half a century, almost entirely out of sight. To understand how big this got, you have to go back further than the gold rush itself, millions of years further. At some point in the deep past, somewhere between roughly 5 and 55 million years ago, depending on which channel and which geologist you ask, a network of rivers ran through what is now the Sierra Nevada. These weren't small creeks. Some ancient channels measured hundreds of feet wide, and in at least one documented case, more than 1,600 feet across at its widest point, wider than most rivers you could name today. Like modern rivers, they carried sediment, and mixed into that sediment, gold eroded out of the surrounding mountains. Then the landscape changed. Volcanic eruptions buried some of these channels under thick layers of ash and lava. Tectonic uplift tilted the entire mountain range, rerouting drainage patterns entirely. By the time humans arrived in California, those ancient rivers were gone. Not dried up, but literally buried. Sometimes under solid rock, sometimes hundreds of feet below the surface, in configurations that had nothing to do with where the modern rivers now flowed. 19th century miners didn't know any of this in geological terms, but they figured out the practical version fast. When they traced the gold in modern stream beds back toward its source, sometimes the trail didn't lead to a hillside. It led into open air, or straight into a solid rock wall, or under a mountain nowhere near any current waterway. The gold, in other words, was coming from somewhere that made no visual sense. The scale of what miners eventually found buried under California is genuinely hard to hold in your head. These ancient or tertiary channels are estimated to have produced around 12 million ounces of gold during the mining era, and geologists with the U.S. Bureau of Mines have estimated that roughly 15 million more ounces remain locked in unmined channel gravel to this day. That's not 15 million ounces guessed at by treasure hunters. That's a government estimate of gold sitting underground in the United States, essentially untouched, because getting it out was never worth the cost again. One popular legend from the era claimed all of these scattered channels were secretly one single continuous ancient river, running the entire length of the Sierra Nevada, sometimes described as stretching from Alaska all the way to Mexico. It's a great story. It's also not true. Geological surveys have shown there was no single master channel. What miners were actually finding was a scattered network of separate ancient rivers and their tributaries, buried at different depths, in different eras, under different kinds of rock. The truth is messier than the legend, and honestly, more impressive, because it means what miners built wasn't one heroic tunnel following one legendary river. It was dozens of separate, competing engineering problems, solved independently, over and over, across an entire mountain range. That's the stage. Now let's go underground. Let's start small, with the basic problem every drift miner had to solve, before we get to the scale that will genuinely surprise you. By the 1850s and 60s, prospectors working the hills around what's now Forest Hill and the surrounding Placer County mining districts had figured out that gold-bearing gravel, the remains of those ancient buried rivers, sometimes sat high up on ridges, far above any modern stream, and often covered by dozens or even hundreds of feet of barren rock and soil. Hydraulic mining, the method that made the era's biggest headlines, solved a similar problem by blasting entire hillsides apart with pressurized water cannons. But hydraulic mining needed one thing above almost everything else: enormous, reliable volumes of water, delivered through networks of ditches and flumes that could stretch for miles. Not every site had that kind of water access. Not every deposit sat where surface blasting made sense, and by the 1880s, growing legal pressure over the environmental damage hydraulic mining caused downstream made the method increasingly risky for companies to rely on. So miners in places like Forest Hill turned to a more targeted, more patient solution: go underground and dig straight to the gravel. Drift mining meant sinking a shaft or driving a horizontal tunnel, called a drift, directly into a hillside, aimed at the depth and angle where a buried channel was believed to run. Unlike hydraulic mining, this method barely touched the surface. No ditches, no water cannons, no hillsides washed away. Just a hole, driven into rock, usually by hand or with black powder, inch by inch, until the crew either hit paying gravel or gave up and tried again somewhere else. Once a tunnel connected with the ancient channel, the real work began. Crews would follow the buried riverbed horizontally, sometimes for enormous distances, mining out the gravel layer by layer, using the same drift and tunnel technique, hauling the ore back out to the surface in carts running on rails. Smaller operations pushed those carts by hand. Larger ones used horses, or later, small locomotive-style trains, pulling loaded cars out in groups of 5 to 10 at a time, each one holding roughly 2 tons of gravel. It was slow. It was expensive to start: timber for bracing tunnel walls, ventilation for men working hundreds of feet underground, blasting powder, wages paid out for months, sometimes years, before a mine produced a single dollar of gold. And it required something hydraulic mining never did: a genuine gamble on geology. A company could sink a shaft, drive a tunnel for months, and simply miss the channel entirely, losing the entire investment on rock that never paid. But when it worked, and when the channel was rich, the returns could be staggering, out of all proportion to the size of ground actually disturbed. Which brings us to a claim near Forest Hill that proved exactly how staggering. That claim was the one we opened with: 800 feet long, 300 feet wide. In the New Jersey mine, that single patch of ground reportedly yielded $1,500,000 in gold. To put that in perspective using the mining method itself, gold-bearing gravel in these districts was often valued at somewhere between $7,000 and $70,000 per linear foot of ancient riverbed, depending on how rich a particular stretch happened to be. The New Jersey claim sat on an unusually generous stretch, and this wasn't an isolated miracle. Zoom out slightly to the small cluster of drift mines working similar gravel deposits on the flank of the Forest Hill Divide, places with names like the Jenny Lind and New Jersey mines, and the collective output from that one localized pocket of ground is estimated at around $5 million. From an area you could walk across, start to finish, in well under an hour. Here's the comparison that makes this land. A hydraulic operation working the same district might move tens of thousands of cubic yards of hillside just to expose a comparable amount of gravel, most of it low grade, requiring enormous volumes of water and infrastructure to process it. A well-placed drift mine, by contrast, could isolate an unusually rich pocket of ancient riverbed and pull a fortune out of a footprint smaller than most modern parking lots, using nothing but a tunnel, a crew, and enough patience to find exactly the right few hundred feet of buried gravel. That's also the catch, and the reason this method never became a guaranteed strategy. For every claim like the New Jersey mine, there were others nearby that drove expensive tunnels for months and hit gravel that barely paid for the powder used to blast it. The record-setting returns were real, but they were the exception, not the rule. Survivorship bias built directly into the historical record, since the mines that failed rarely got written about at all. As for what's left today, almost nothing marks the spot. No monument, no visible scar in the landscape the way hydraulic mining left behind. The tunnel mouths from mines like the New Jersey and Jenny Lind have mostly collapsed or been swallowed by forest regrowth across the hills above Forest Hill. What survives is scattered through old mining company records, geological surveys, and the occasional historical society archive. Numbers on a page, describing fortunes that were, by the standards of their time, genuinely enormous, pulled out of ground you could walk past today without ever knowing what happened underneath it. And this was still the small case. The tunnels were about to get a lot longer, the channels a lot wider, and the engineering considerably more audacious. If the New Jersey mine was a lucky pocket, the Forest Hill Divide was the whole vein of luck laid end to end, and it's still considered, by mining historians, the most famous drift mining ground in California. The problem here wasn't finding gold-bearing gravel, it was following it. The buried channel running through the divide wasn't a single, contained pocket. It was a sinuous, ancient riverbed that geologists and mining engineers eventually traced for almost 14 miles, from the northeast end of the district down to its outlet at the southwest end, near a rise called Peckham Hill. That's not one company's tunnel. That's an underground river system, intercepted by half a dozen separate mining operations at different points along its length. The Hazard Shaft, the Paragon Mine, the Mayflower Mine, the Live Oak Tunnel, the Dardanelles Mine, the Georgia Hill Tunnel, the Gray Eagle Mine, each one essentially drilling into the same ancient plumbing from a different angle, often without knowing exactly where their neighbors' tunnels ended and their own began. Take the Paragon Mine as one example of how this actually worked. Hydraulic mining first exposed the Forest Hill Channel there back in 1852, on the south flank of the divide, roughly 2 miles northeast of the town of Forest Hill. But once the accessible surface gravel ran out, hydraulic mining gave way to drift mining, which simply followed the channel underground, eventually driving a bedrock tunnel more than 8,000 feet into the divide along the strike of the ancient river. Then, in 1859, engineers connected the Paragon's workings with the neighboring Mayflower Mine. The result? Almost 5 continuous miles of underground tunnel, dug entirely by hand in black powder, following a single buried channel through one mountain divide. 5 miles of tunnel, and this was just one connected segment of a channel that stretched for 14. The channel itself averaged around 300 feet wide, though the richest part, the deepest channel bottom, called the Thalweg, was typically only about 50 feet across, meaning miners had to thread their tunnels with real precision to stay on the paying ground. Pay gravel usually ran 2 to 7 feet thick, yielding on average around $10 per ton processed, a modest number per ton that, multiplied across miles of tunnel and years of operation, added up to a genuinely industrial-scale enterprise, run not by lone prospectors but by mining companies with engineers, surveyors, and payrolls. If you want the single number that captures how far miners were willing to go, look at the Hidden Treasure Mountain Gate Tunnel, on the opposite side of the Forest Hill Divide, at a place called Damascus. The tunnel's entrance sat at an elevation of 3,748 feet. From there it was driven horizontally into the mountain for over 7,000 feet. More than a mile of solid rock, excavated by hand, before it even reached the gravel it was built to find. And here's the detail that makes the engineering genuinely impressive. The summit of the divide above that tunnel sat nearly 1,000 feet higher than the ancient stream channel the miners were chasing. They weren't just tunneling sideways into a hill. They were threading a shaft at a precise depth and angle, deep inside a mountain, aiming for a target they could not see and had never seen, based entirely on inference from surface geology and the results of nearby claims. What was on the other end justified the effort. The Hidden Treasure Mountain Gate Channel ran through the property for a distance of 18,000 feet, well over 3 miles. Mining records from the period describe it as a river of unusual size among the ancient streams, and at one point it measured more than 1,600 feet wide, with the widest breasted gravel face reaching 800 feet across, averaging around 400 feet. Zoom out to the mine that anchored this case, the Paragon. By 1911, after nearly 6 decades of mixed hydraulic and drift operations, it was almost entirely worked out. Its lifetime production came to roughly $1,425,000 from the Forest Hill Channel alone, about $500,000 from the earlier hydraulic years, and $950,000 from drifting, plus another $900,000 from a separate upper channel, and $75,000 more from a smaller side channel called the Orono. Today, most of what remains of the Forest Hill Divide's mining network survives only as entries in state and federal mineral resource databases, coordinates, shaft depths, and production estimates attached to tunnel mouths that, on the ground, are mostly collapsed, gated, or quietly reclaimed by forest. It's the kind of history that exists almost entirely on paper now, describing a landscape that, to a modern hiker, would look like nothing more than an ordinary ridge. Everything so far has involved tunneling through ordinary rock and soil to reach buried gravel. Table Mountain, straddling Tuolumne and Calaveras counties, raised the difficulty by an entire geological order of magnitude, because there, the ancient river wasn't just buried, it was sealed under a solidified river of lava. Table Mountain is a long, flat-topped ridge formed by a stack of volcanic flows that, eroded down over millions of years, now extends for roughly 80 miles between the towns of Knights Ferry and Sonora. Millions of years ago, according to the geology miners eventually pieced together, an eruption sent lava and mud pouring down an existing river valley, essentially entombing the ancient channel and its gold-bearing gravel underneath a solid volcanic cap. To reach that gravel, miners couldn't just tunnel through soft dirt and loose rock. They had to identify where the buried river ran beneath the mountain, then drive a tunnel through genuinely hard volcanic stone to get underneath it. It worked, and it worked at a scale that's easy to underestimate today. An account published in 1856 put the number of miners tunneling and prospecting Table Mountain across Calaveras, Tuolumne, and San Joaquin counties combined at no less than 3,000 people, with a good number of them, in the language of the time, having already cut the lead and struck paying gravel. The rock layers those miners were cutting through tell their own story about deep time. The volcanic cap itself has been dated to around 9 million years old. Beneath that sit older volcanic ash and rock layers reaching back roughly 21 million years, and older rhyolite deposits dated to about 33 million years. And beneath all of that volcanic material, sitting in the pre-volcanic gravel the miners were actually digging for, geologists have found material estimated at up to 55 million years old. In other words, some of what these 19th century miners pulled out of Table Mountain had been sealed underground for longer than most of the mammal groups alive today have existed in anything like their current form. One of the operations working this ground was the Montezuma Tunnel Company, which in 1877, under Superintendent J.H. Neal, drove the Montezuma Tunnel directly into the gravel underlying the Table Mountain lava. It was inside that tunnel that things took an unexpected turn. At a distance of roughly 1,400 to 1,500 feet from the mouth of the Montezuma Tunnel, deep enough that the miners were working 200 to 300 feet beyond the edge of the solid lava cap above them, Neal later stated that his crew found several stone spearheads made of dark rock, nearly a foot long, sitting in gravel that was, by the geology available at the time, assumed to be extraordinarily old. It wasn't an isolated incident. Other shafts and tunnels driven into Table Mountain over the following decades turned up stone mortars, pestles, and, in the discovery that became the most famous of all, a human skull, reportedly recovered from deep inside a mine shaft in 1866. The exact recorded depth varies between contemporary accounts, and that inconsistency matters, because what happened next turned into one of the strangest scientific controversies of the 19th century. If the skull genuinely came from gravel that old, it would have meant humans were present in North America for a length of time that 19th century science, and for what it's worth, modern science too, considered essentially impossible. Prominent geologist Josiah Whitney, head of the California Geological Survey, argued the find was authentic, and it became known nationally as the Calaveras skull, cited for decades in debates over the true age of humanity in the Americas. Skeptics pushed back immediately, pointing out an obvious, unglamorous possibility. An active mine is full of shafts, drifts, tunnels, and miners moving between claims. More than enough opportunity for an object to end up mixed into the wrong layer of gravel, whether by accident or as a prank on a scientist people found a little too easy to fool. To be direct about where the evidence stands today, the overwhelming modern consensus is that the Calaveras skull is not genuine evidence of ancient humans in North America. Most researchers believe it came from a far more recent burial and was, deliberately or not, introduced into the ancient gravel. But it took decades of publication, argument, and reputational damage to get there, and even now some details of exactly how it happened are disputed rather than settled fact. Here's the part worth sitting with. That skull, real or not, became one of the most discussed archaeological objects in the country. Dissected in scientific journals, argued over at academic meetings, remembered by name a century and a half later. The men who spent months of their lives tunneling by hand through solid volcanic rock to make that discovery possible are, for the most part, not remembered by name at all. Mining districts like this one were built on the labor of miners whose backgrounds and identities barely made it into any company ledger, including the significant number of Chinese immigrant laborers working California's gold country at the time, men who, thanks to discriminatory taxes and exclusion from staking their own claims, often did the hardest underground work while receiving the least credit and the least protection. The mountain gave up a scientific sensation. It rarely gave up the names of the people who dug for it. Zoom all the way out now, past any single mine or mountain, to the full industrial footprint of drift mining across just one California county. By 1890, mining engineer J. H. Hobson estimated that Placer County alone still contained roughly 200 miles of unworked auriferous gravel channel, ancient riverbed already identified, simply not yet mined, along with what he described as an immense area of auriferous metamorphic rock, laced with additional gold-bearing quartz veins. 200 miles of known, mappable, ancient river hidden underground in a single county, considered still waiting to be worked. Based on results already achieved at districts like Forest Hill, Iowa Hill, and Canada Hill, Hobson valued that unworked gravel at somewhere between $7,000 and $70,000 per linear foot, depending on richness, the same wide range we saw back at the New Jersey mine, now applied across 200 miles instead of a few hundred feet. This is the scale where drift mining stops looking like a collection of individual lucky strikes and starts looking like what it actually was, a decades-long, multi-company industrial campaign to systematically map and empty an entire buried river network, one tunnel at a time, across an area far larger than any single mountain or divide. By the mid-1880s, that campaign had a very specific reason to accelerate. In 1884, a landmark court ruling known as the Sawyer decision effectively ended large-scale hydraulic mining across California after years of lawsuits over flood damage and buried farmland downstream. Companies that had spent decades blasting hillsides apart with water cannons suddenly needed a new way to reach the same gold-bearing gravel without running afoul of the law. Drift mining, which barely disturbed the surface and produced almost no downstream debris, was one of the few methods still standing. Contemporary accounts from the period describe the result plainly. Wherever the beds of these ancient rivers could be reached by shaft or tunnel, they were worked by drifting and yielded large profits, precisely because hydraulic mining, for the first time in decades, was no longer an option. What that meant on the ground was a patchwork of drift mining districts strung across Placer County and its neighbors, each with its own network of tunnels converging on the same larger system of buried channels. Forest Hill and the Divide we've already covered, but also Iowa Hill, Michigan Bluff, Yankee Gyms, Dutch Flat, and Gold Run, where the enormous Stewart hydraulic mine had already carved out a tailings pile so large it's still visible on satellite imagery today. Each district ran its own companies, its own crews, its own competing claims, all of them ultimately digging toward the same ancient drainage system that had, tens of millions of years earlier, carried gold down out of a very different Sierra Nevada. 200 miles of estimated unworked channel, spread across dozens of active mining districts, worked by companies using everything from hand-pushed carts to horse teams to small underground rail lines. This is no longer a story about individual fortune hunters. It's the story of an entire regional industry, built to chase something that, geologically, had not existed for millions of years. So what did all of that actually add up to? Historical estimates for this broader area, the combined drift mining output of the Forest Hill, Iowa Hill, and Gold Run districts together, put the total at more than $840 million in the dollars of the era, from drift mining alone. Lode, or hard rock quartz mining, in the same districts added several million more on top of that. As with many 19th century mining estimates, the precise figure varies depending on the source and how the district is defined, so treat it as a well-supported historical estimate rather than an exact audited total. But even accounting for that uncertainty, the scale is not in serious doubt. Here's the comparison worth sitting with. Go back to where we started this video, the New Jersey mine, 800 feet by 300 feet, $1,500,000 in gold. The broader district total of $840 million is roughly 560 times that single claim's output, produced using fundamentally the same technology, the same tunnels, the same ore cars, the same crews working by candlelight, following gravel they couldn't see until they'd already dug to it. Nothing about the underlying method changed between that one small, lucky claim and the $840 million regional total. What changed was scale, the same basic trick repeated relentlessly by dozens of companies across 200 miles of buried river for the better part of half a century. That's the ceiling of what drift mining, as a technology, was capable of. It took an enormous, sustained, labor-intensive effort, and it worked, spectacularly, right up until something faster came along. It's also worth being clear about what that $840 million figure actually represents, and what it doesn't. It's a historical estimate for cumulative output, compiled well after the fact from company records, county assessments, and mining bureau reports that weren't always consistent with each other. The kind of number that later researchers cite with real confidence in its rough magnitude, while acknowledging the precise total will never be fully reconciled. And remember, this is on top of the 200 miles of channel that, as of that same era, was estimated to still be sitting there, unworked. The $840 million was the return on only part of what miners had already identified underground. The rest simply wasn't economical to chase by tunnel, even at the industry's peak. None of that changes the basic shape of the comparison. A claim you could walk across in minutes produced $1.5 million. A network of tunnels spread across an entire mining district, built by dozens of competing companies over the better part of half a century, produced hundreds of times that, using the same core idea over and over, until an entire buried river system had been picked apart, seam by seam, mile after underground mile. Drift mining didn't die because the gold ran out. In many districts, it didn't. It died because someone built a machine that could do, in an afternoon, what a drift mining crew needed months to accomplish. That machine was the bucket line dredge, essentially a floating, mechanized excavator that dug its way through old riverbeds using a continuous chain of steel buckets, processing the gravel on board and discharging the waste behind it as it crept forward through its own artificial pond. By the early 20th century, a modern bucket elevator dredge could excavate on the order of 10,000 cubic yards of material a day, using buckets with roughly 16 cubic feet of capacity each. Combined, the dredging operations across the Oroville, Yuba, and Folsom districts alone represented an estimated 30 million cubic yards of annual output, backed by more than $5 million of invested capital. One well-documented dredge of the period could process about 90,000 cubic yards of river gravel every week, enough, in a good week, to yield roughly 30 pounds of gold. Now compare crews. A drift mine of any real size needed dozens of workers, men underground driving tunnels and loading 2-ton ore cars by hand, hauling them out in trains of 5 to 10 cars at a time, plus surface crews to process what came out. A large dredge, by contrast, often needed a total operating crew of only around 3 men to actually run it at any given moment, an oiler on each end and an operator, even though it could outproduce an entire drift mining crew's monthly output in a single day. Everything the miners had spent decades learning how to find underground, the exact depth, width, and richness of a buried channel, a dredge simply chewed through wholesale, without a single tunnel, without a single man working by candlelight hundreds of feet underground. Drift mining survived in pockets into the 20th century, mostly at smaller operations working channels too deep or too narrow for a dredge to reach. But as an industry-defining method, it was over. The river of moving water and gold that had vanished millions of years earlier had finally been outcompeted, underground, by a machine built to move faster than the men who'd spent half a century learning to find it. Most of the companies behind this story didn't end dramatically. They simply ran out of paying ground, or ran out of investors willing to keep funding tunnels that weren't producing, and quietly folded. The hydraulic companies that had started this whole chapter of California mining fared worse, at least legally. North Bloomfield, the mining company at the center of the Sawyer decision, kept operating in defiance of the ruling and was heavily fined in 1886. It was fined again in 1890 for failing to obtain a required operating license under new state regulations. Large-scale hydraulic mining in California never really recovered after that. Drift mining, meanwhile, faded rather than collapsed. Government mineral reports from as late as the 1940s still record small operations working these ancient channels. One 1948 report, for instance, notes a modest drift mine in the Dutch Flat district recovering 53 ounces of gold and 7 ounces of silver for the entire year, a fraction of what a single good month at the New Jersey mine had produced 60 years earlier. By then, the same report describes far larger tonnages being handled instead by dragline and bucket line dredges nearby, working through hundreds of thousands of cubic yards a year. The math had simply stopped favoring tunnels. Some of the ground itself changed hands from drift mining companies to dredging operations directly, as the newer, faster method proved it could profitably rework channels the tunnel crews had already partially exploited. In effect, the underground gold rush didn't end with a bang. It was gradually absorbed, claim by claim, into the machine that replaced it. Physically, most drift mines simply stopped being maintained. Underground timber bracing, meant to hold back loose gravel and rock, was never built to last a century. Once a company stopped actively working a tunnel, water and gravity did the rest. Shafts flooded, drifts caved. What had taken years and enormous sums of money to dig by hand collapsed, in many cases, within a generation or two of being abandoned, leaving little more than a depression in a hillside and a name on an old county map. In the Gold Run district, the enormous tailings pile left by the Stewart hydraulic mine remained visible for a different reason entirely. Hydraulic debris doesn't decay the way an unmaintained tunnel does, which is part of why the hydraulic side of this story ended up so much more visible than the drift mining side, despite the two methods working the exact same underlying gravel. By the mid-20th century, the industry that remained bore almost no resemblance to its 19th century peak. Small crews, modest yields, equipment shared across multiple marginal claims, a quiet, diminished echo of an era when a single 800 by 300 foot claim could pull in $1.5 million almost by accident. If you want to see physical evidence of this era, the most visible remnant is actually from the sister technology, not drift mining itself. Malakoff-Diggins State Historic Park in Nevada County preserves the eroded cliffs and colorful exposed cliffs left behind by hydraulic mining, a dramatic, still visible scar that stands in for an era that, underground, left almost nothing behind to photograph. Table Mountain itself is still there, still hikeable, still forming the long, distinctive, flat-topped ridge running through Tuolumne and Calaveras counties that miners once tunneled beneath in search of a river sealed under solidified lava. A handful of old tunnel entrances remain visible along its flanks, though most are collapsed or fenced off for safety. Quiet monuments to both the mining effort and the scientific controversy it accidentally triggered. The Forest Hill Divide's mines survive mainly on paper now, cataloged in federal and state mineral resource databases, and documented in detail by local organizations like the Forest Hill Divide's own Historical Society, which has preserved period mining journals describing tunnels, channels, and production figures in the miners' own words. And here's the detail that lingers longest. According to that earlier U.S. Bureau of Mines estimate, roughly 15 million ounces of gold may still sit inside these ancient, unmined channels, technically locatable, technically valuable, and almost entirely left alone, because after bucket line dredging and modern mining economics, digging it out by hand, tunnel by tunnel, the way 19th century miners once did, simply isn't worth it anymore. The vanished river, in other words, is still down there. It's just no longer worth chasing. If you actually went looking for the physical remains today, you wouldn't find much drama. No blasted open canyons, no dramatic tailings piles marking the spot. Mostly you'd find quiet, overgrown depressions and hillsides where a tunnel mouth used to be, sometimes marked with a rusted piece of rail or a rotted timber frame, sometimes marked with nothing at all, just a name on a 19th century mining map that no longer corresponds to anything visible on the ground. That absence of drama is, in its own way, the whole point of this story. Hydraulic mining left California with permanent, photographable scars. Drift mining left California with paperwork, place names, and an underground network that mostly sealed itself back up once people stopped paying attention to it. Think for a second about the last time you drove through hill country anywhere. Not necessarily California, just anywhere with rolling, uneven terrain, and the road curved for no reason you could immediately explain. Or you passed a ridge that looked, from a distance, just slightly too flat on top to be natural. Most of the time, that's nothing. Ordinary erosion, ordinary geology. But every so often, what you're looking at is the buried outline of something that used to move. A river, a valley, a piece of landscape that existed in a completely different configuration, millions of years before anyone was around to see it change. Most of us will never notice. We don't have a reason to look for it, and unlike a canyon blasted apart by a water cannon, there's usually nothing dramatic left on the surface to give it away. For about half a century, a scattered, stubborn, remarkably resourceful group of people did notice, and did something almost nobody else would have thought to do about it. They didn't just wonder where the vanished river had gone. They tunneled into a mountain to go find it, based on nothing but inference, patience, and a willingness to be wrong most of the time in exchange for occasionally being spectacularly right. That's the part of this story worth carrying with you. Not just the staggering dollar figures or the accidental scientific controversy, but the basic, strange confidence it took to look at a solid hillside and say, with total certainty, there used to be a river here, and I'm going to go get what it left behind. It's a confidence that, in a smaller way, still shapes how people look at ordinary ground. Geologists still use the logic those miners stumbled into, that a landscape's present shape is rarely its only shape, that rivers move and vanish and get buried, that gold sitting in a modern streambed almost always came from somewhere higher up and further back in time. Most of us will never need that logic for anything as dramatic as a gold rush, but it's a useful thing to remember anyway, that the ground under an ordinary hillside is not just rock. Sometimes it's a record. And every so often, for about half a century in California, people were willing to tunnel through a mountain just to read it. If this kind of forgotten, hiding in plain sight engineering story is your thing, subscribe. This channel exists specifically to dig up stories like this one before they disappear entirely. And here's what I want from you in the comments. Not just what did you think, but a specific direction. What's another piece of everyday infrastructure or landscape that's secretly hiding a huge, forgotten engineering story underneath it? An old canal system that's been paved over, a rail tunnel nobody uses anymore, a pipeline route that shaped a town's entire layout. Drop the lead, and there's a decent chance it becomes the next deep dive. If you made it this far underground with me, you already know what to do. Hit like, and I'll see you in the next tunnel.